In the vast, frozen expanse of Fairbanks, Alaska, where winter nights stretched into infinity and bitter winds punished everything in their path, Ethan Reynolds had grown accustomed to silence. The modest cabin he now called home stood as a sentinel against the merciless elements, its wooden bones creaking under the weight of accumulated snow. After leaving his former life behind, he had found an unexpected peace in this self-imposed exile, where each day was marked only by the crackling of firewood and the haunting symphony of the wind. That particular evening, as temperatures plummeted to dangerous levels and snow piled relentlessly against his door, Ethan sat in his worn leather armchair, nursing a cup of hot coffee while reviewing his weather station readings. The forecast predicted one of the worst storms of the season, and he had already double-checked his emergency supplies. The isolation that usually brought him comfort suddenly felt different, heavier somehow, as if the universe was holding its breath. The first sound was subtle, almost lost in the howling tempest, a gentle scratching against the wooden porch. Ethan dismissed it initially, assuming the wind had dragged branches or debris against the house. But then it came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a low whimper that made him sit up straight. His instincts, honed by years of living in the wilderness, told him this was different. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled on his heavy coat and boots. The floorboards protested beneath his feet as he approached the door, his breath visible in the cold air that seeped through the frame. When he finally opened it, a blast of Arctic air rushed in, carrying with it stinging particles of ice and snow. What he saw made him freeze in place. There, trembling violently on his porch, stood a German shepherd, her coat crusted with ice and snow. Her amber eyes reflected a complex mixture of fear and determination, but she wasn't alone. Huddled against her side was a puppy, barely moving, its tiny chest rising and falling with visible difficulty. The mother's gaze never wavered from Ethan's face, even as he took a cautious step forward. There was a silent plea in those intelligent eyes, a desperate request that transcended the barriers between species. Without further hesitation, Ethan carefully lifted the puppy, feeling its fragile body beneath layers of ice. He gestured for the mother to follow him inside, and after a moment's reluctance, she crossed the threshold, surrendering to the cabin's warmth. He placed the puppy gently on a blanket near the fireplace, methodically rubbing it with a towel to restore its circulation. The mother remained vigilant, her eyes fixed on every movement, waiting for a verdict on her offspring's fate. As Ethan worked to warm the animals, he noticed something odd about the mother dog. Despite her exhaustion, her instincts remained sharp. Whenever the wind died down and silence settled over the cabin, she would tense up, her ears pricked towards something he couldn't perceive. There was intelligence in her behavior that spoke of training, but also a wariness that suggested recent trauma. While preparing some food for his unexpected guests, Ethan caught sight of something on the mother's collar. A partially erased identification number, as if someone had deliberately tried to remove it. The discovery sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Who would do such a thing? And why had this dog appeared at his doorstep, desperately trying to save her puppy? As the storm raged outside, cutting off all communication with the outside world, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that these visitors weren't here by chance. The mother dog, whom he decided to call Dakota, had chosen his cabin specifically, but the reason remained unclear. With each passing hour, her behavior became more intriguing. She would periodically check the windows, her body tense, as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the swirling snow. If this story has caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. The next morning brought an uneasy stillness to the Alaskan wilderness. The storm had temporarily subsided, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that sparkled under the weak winter sun. Ethan's morning routine of collecting firewood came to an abrupt halt when something caught his eye. Footprints in the snow, partially covered by fresh powder, leading to his cabin. They weren't just Dakota's paw prints. There were human tracks as well, and they definitely weren't his. Inside, Dakota had already sensed his unease. She stood alert by the window, her ears forward, tracking something beyond human perception. The puppy, whom Ethan had named Baxter, was showing signs of improvement, eagerly lapping up the warm milk mixture he had prepared. But Dakota wouldn't relax, her body language suggesting an underlying tension that contradicted the peaceful scene outside. During a more thorough examination of Dakota's collar, Ethan discovered something he'd missed in the chaos of the previous night. Besides the scratched-out identification number, there was a tiny compartment cleverly hidden in the leather. His fingers trembled slightly as he worked to open it, aware that he might be crossing some invisible line. When he finally managed to pry it open, a small microchip fell into his palm, along with a folded piece of paper bearing a series of numbers. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Was Dakota more than just a lost dog? The sophistication of the hidden compartment suggested something larger at play. His thoughts were interrupted by a distant sound that made Dakota's head snap up, the low rumble of an approaching vehicle. Ethan quickly moved to the window, staying hidden behind the curtain as he watched a black SUV crawl past his cabin, its tinted windows revealing nothing about its occupants. Later that morning, Ethan decided to investigate the area around his property. With Dakota by his side and Baxter safely tucked in his jacket, he followed the mysterious footprints. They led to an old barn on the outskirts of his property, a structure he rarely visited. Dakota's behavior changed dramatically as they approached. Her tail lowered and she began to whine softly, circling the building with obvious agitation. Inside the barn, evidence of recent human presence was unmistakable. Fresh scratches marked the wooden walls, and scattered supplies suggested someone had been using it as a temporary shelter. Among the debris, Ethan found a weathered newspaper clipping that made his heart race. The partially visible headline discussed a highly trained search and rescue dog that had vanished during a classified operation a year ago. The photograph matched Dakota perfectly. The article mentioned the dog's exceptional abilities and specialized training in detecting certain substances, but much of the text was redacted. What caught Ethan's attention was a quote from the handler. She wasn't just any dog. She was a key part of an ongoing investigation. The rest of the article was too damaged to read, but it was enough to confirm his suspicions. Dakota's appearance at his cabin wasn't a coincidence. As they made their way back to the cabin, Ethan noticed Dakota's increasingly protective behavior toward both him and Baxter. She would stop periodically, scanning their surroundings with an intensity that spoke of her professional training. The wind carried distant sounds that made her freeze. The crack of branches, the whisper of movement through snow. Sounds that might have seemed natural, but now felt orchestrated. Back in the safety of his cabin, Ethan began researching the numbers from the paper he'd found in Dakota's collar. Each attempt to trace them led to dead ends, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were some kind of code. The microchip, too sophisticated to be a standard pet identifier, remained a mystery he couldn't solve with his limited resources. As evening approached, bringing with it another storm front, Ethan noticed something else. Small red lights blinking in the distance, visible only when darkness fell. They appeared to be moving in a pattern, like silent sentinels watching his cabin. Dakota's reaction to these lights was unmistakable. She would grow restless whenever they appeared, positioning herself between them and Baxter, her maternal instincts warring with what seemed to be trained responses. The next few days brought an unsettling routine to Ethan's previously quiet life. The mysterious SUV had become a regular sight, passing by his cabin at odd hours, its presence a silent reminder that something larger was unfolding. Dakota's behavior continued to intrigue him. She would spend hours by the window, her attention divided between protecting Baxter and monitoring the outside world with an almost military precision. Determined to understand more about his four-legged guests, Ethan began reaching out to his limited contacts in town, using his emergency radio during the brief periods when the weather permitted transmission. Sarah Martinez, an old friend who worked at the local veterinary clinic, provided him with surprising information. The microchip's technology was unlike anything she had encountered. Military grade, she suspected, though she couldn't access its contents. One afternoon, while Dakota and Baxter napped by the fire, Ethan noticed something peculiar about the numbers from the collar. They seemed to follow a pattern similar to geographical coordinates. Cross-referencing them with his maps of Alaska revealed a location deep in the wilderness, about 50 miles from his cabin. The area was marked as restricted on most maps, with no indication of what lay there. His research was interrupted by Dakota's sudden alertness. She stood rigid, ears forward, staring at the wall as if she could see through it. Moments later, Ethan heard it too, the distinct sound of a helicopter approaching, flying unusually low for the weather conditions. He watched through the window as the aircraft circled the area twice before disappearing into the clouds. Dakota's reaction was telling. She hadn't barked or shown aggression, but rather displayed recognition, as if the sound was familiar. That evening, an unexpected break in the weather allowed Ethan to pick up a clear radio signal. As he adjusted the frequency, he caught fragments of a conversation that made him freeze. A set still operational. Tracking signal confirmed. Priority retrieval due. The voices were professional, clipped, using military jargon. Before he could hear more, the signal dissolved into static, but Dakota's reaction to the voices had been unmistakable. Her training showing through as she sat at attention, eyes fixed on the radio. Later, while reviewing the newspaper clipping more carefully, Ethan discovered a watermark when holding it up to the light. A logo he recognized from his previous life working in environmental research. The organization, Global Environmental Research Institute, GERI, had been involved in several classified projects monitoring climate changes in remote locations. The connection sparked a memory. Last year's mysterious shutdown of a research station in the area, the details of which had never been made public. The pieces were starting to come together, but the full picture remained elusive. Dakota wasn't just any search and rescue dog. She had been part of something bigger. The specialized training, the sophisticated microchip, the coordinates, they all pointed to a sophisticated operation. But what had caused her to flee with her puppy? And why had she chosen his cabin specifically? As if sensing his thoughts, Dakota approached and placed her head on his knee, her amber eyes holding that same intelligent, almost human-like expression he'd noticed the first night. Baxter, now much stronger, playfully tumbled nearby, unaware of the complex web surrounding his mother. The puppy's presence seemed to be key to understanding Dakota's actions. She hadn't just escaped, she had chosen to protect her offspring at all costs. The next morning brought another discovery. While Dakota accompanied him on his routine perimeter check, she suddenly veered off toward a fallen log near the property line. Her determined digging revealed a weathered backpack, partially buried in the snow. Inside, Ethan found sophisticated monitoring equipment, badly damaged but still recognizable as environmental testing gear. More intriguingly, there was a notebook filled with encrypted notes and a series of photographs showing various locations around Alaska, including what appeared to be research stations. The final photograph made his breath catch. It showed Dakota in her working gear, standing proudly next to a team of researchers in front of a facility. The building's location matched the coordinates from her collar, but what drew Ethan's attention was the expression of the man standing next to her. While everyone else smiled for the camera, this individual's face showed tension, his hand gripping Dakota's leash with unnecessary force. The date stamp placed the image just 3 months before her disappearance. The discovery of the backpack changed everything. As Ethan spread its contents across his kitchen table, the pieces of the puzzle began shifting into a clearer picture. The environmental monitoring equipment wasn't standard issue. It had been modified to detect something specific. Several of the devices featured the Jerry logo, but with additional markings that suggested military involvement. Dakota watched him intently as he examined each item, her behavior suggesting she recognized the equipment. When he handled certain devices, she would paw at them gently, as if trying to demonstrate their importance. The encrypted notebook proved particularly interesting. Though he couldn't decipher the code, he noticed patterns in the writing that corresponded to the dates of several unexplained environmental anomalies in the region. A sudden burst of static from his radio made both of them jump. Through the interference, a voice came through clearer than before. Target location confirmed. Evidence suggests compromise of Project Aurora. Immediate containment required. The transmission cut off abruptly, but Dakota's reaction told Ethan everything he needed to know. Her ears had perked up at the mention of Project Aurora, and her body language shifted from alert to anxious. Studying the photograph from the backpack more carefully, Ethan noticed details he'd missed initially. The facility in the background had subtle security features that seemed excessive for a simple research station. Motion sensors, reinforced doors, and what appeared to be a sophisticated surveillance system. The man gripping Dakota's leash wore a badge that was partially visible, showing not just the Jerry logo, but also a classified project designation. AUR-7. That evening, while organizing the documents, Ethan found something tucked into the notebook's binding, a small data drive carefully concealed. His old laptop took several attempts to read it, but when it finally loaded, his screen filled with technical documents and research data. Most files were heavily encrypted, but one opened, a research log that detailed the true nature of Project Aurora. The project had started as a legitimate environmental research initiative, using specially trained dogs like Dakota to detect changes in permafrost composition. But the dogs had discovered something unexpected, evidence of rare Earth elements essential for advanced technology, hidden deep within Alaska's frozen ground. The military's interest had been immediate and overwhelming. Dakota's unique abilities had made her particularly valuable. Her sensitive nose could detect trace elements that even sophisticated equipment missed, and her intelligence allowed her to map complex underground deposits. But according to the logs, she had begun showing signs of distress 3 months into the project. Around the same time, she'd become pregnant with Baxter. The final entry in the log made Ethan's blood run cold. Assets showing increasing reluctance to participate in extension phase. Rehabilitation protocols recommended before subject becomes compromised. Puppy situation requires immediate resolution. The entry was dated just days before Dakota's disappearance. As if understanding that her story was being revealed, Dakota moved closer to Ethan, pressing against his leg while keeping Baxter within sight. The puppy had grown stronger each day, his playful nature a stark contrast to the tension surrounding them. Looking at them together, Ethan understood. Dakota hadn't just been running from something, she had been protecting her son from becoming part of the project. A new sound outside drew their attention. The crunch of tires on snow, different from the usual SUV. Through the window, Ethan spotted a white van parking at the far end of his property, its unmarked sides pristine against the snowy backdrop. 2 figures emerged, carrying what looked like scientific equipment. Their movements were methodical, professional, as they began setting up some kind of monitoring station. Dakota's reaction was immediate, but controlled. She herded Baxter into the bedroom, then returned to stand guard by the window, her posture suggesting she was ready to act, but waiting for the right moment. Her training was evident in every movement, but now it served a different purpose, protecting her family rather than following commands. The true scope of what Ethan had stumbled into was becoming clear. Dakota wasn't just a highly trained military asset. She was a mother who had made a conscious choice to protect her offspring from a fate she had glimpsed in those classified documents. Her appearance at his cabin hadn't been random either. The coordinates in her collar suggested she had known about this location, perhaps as a designated safe zone from her training days. The white van's presence marked a turning point. Ethan knew he had to make a decision, and fast. His past experience in environmental research had taught him enough about classified projects to understand that time was running out. Through his binoculars, he observed the two figures methodically setting up their equipment, their movements suggesting military training despite their civilian appearance. Sarah from the veterinary clinic had come through with crucial information. Her encrypted message, received through his emergency radio, confirmed his suspicions about Dakota's unique abilities. The dog wasn't just trained to detect environmental changes. She had been part of a breakthrough in geological surveying that could revolutionize or potentially destabilize the entire rare earth element industry. As evening approached, more vehicles began arriving at discrete intervals. Another white van, two more SUVs, all parking at different points around his property's perimeter. They were setting up a containment grid, standard procedure for recovering what they considered sensitive assets. Dakota watched their movements with increasing agitation, her training clearly helping her recognize the pattern of their operations. Through the gathered documents, Ethan had pieced together more of the story. Project Aurora had discovered that certain dogs, particularly those with Dakota's genetic lineage, could detect specific rare earth elements with remarkable accuracy. This ability, combined with their intelligence and trainability, made them invaluable for covert geological surveys. Dakota had been their star performer until something in the project had changed, something that had driven her to protect Baxter at all costs. The encrypted notebook yielded more secrets under Ethan's persistent efforts to decode it. References to Phase 2 appeared frequently in the later entries, along with mentions of genetic studies and breeding programs. The implications were clear. They hadn't just wanted Dakota for her abilities, they had plans for her offspring. Baxter wasn't just her puppy, he was potentially the next generation of their program. A new transmission crackled through his radio. Perimeter secure, awaiting authorization for retrieval protocol. The response came swiftly. Authorization granted. Remember, primary asset must be secured intact. Secondary target is priority for research continuation. The clinical way they referred to Dakota and Baxter made Ethan's jaw clench. These weren't just research subjects, they were living beings who had sought his help. That's when Ethan noticed something odd about Dakota's behavior. She wasn't just watching the vehicles, she was paying special attention to the equipment they were setting up. Her training seemed to be telling her something about their intentions. When one of the devices activated, sending out a low-frequency pulse that Ethan could barely hear, Dakota's reaction was immediate. She began pushing Baxter toward the cabin's back door. Understanding dawned on Ethan. The equipment wasn't just for surveillance. They were setting up a containment system designed specifically for dogs with Dakota's training. They intended to use her own enhanced senses against her, but Dakota's intelligence had evolved beyond their expectations. She wasn't just responding to commands anymore. She was thinking independently, strategizing. In that moment, Ethan made his choice. His cabin had been his refuge, a place to hide from the world, but now it needed to become something else, a starting point for a new journey. He began gathering essential supplies, his military experience guiding his selections. Dakota watched him with apparent approval, her eyes showing an understanding that transcended species barriers. Through his window, Ethan could see more activity as the sun began to set. The teams were setting up powerful lights, preparing for a night operation. They were done, waiting and watching. Their movements suggested they planned to move in before dawn, using the cover of darkness and their sophisticated equipment to their advantage. What they hadn't counted on was Ethan's intimate knowledge of the Alaskan wilderness, gained through years of living in isolation. As he studied his topographical maps, marking routes and checking elevations, Dakota positioned herself beside him, her intelligence apparent as she seemed to follow his planning. Baxter, sensing the tension but unable to understand it, stayed close to his mother, his presence a constant reminder of what was at stake. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Ethan decoded the last entry in the notebook. It detailed a network of old environmental research stations, many of them abandoned but still maintained as emergency shelters. One location stood out, a remote station near the Canadian border, far from any active Project Aurora sites. The coordinates aligned with a sequence of numbers he'd found hidden in Dakota's collar. The pre-dawn hours brought an eerie silence to the Alaskan wilderness. The teams surrounding Ethan's cabin had completed their preparations, their sophisticated equipment casting a faint electronic hum into the darkness. But what they didn't realize was that Ethan, Dakota, and Baxter were already implementing their carefully crafted plan. Using his years of experience in the Alaskan wilderness, Ethan had spent the previous hours preparing. He'd loaded his old truck with essential supplies, carefully hidden it in a natural depression behind the cabin, and covered it with a snow camouflage tarp. The vehicle's engine had been modified years ago to run almost silently, a modification that would now prove invaluable. Dakota's training proved to be their greatest advantage. She could detect the electronic surveillance equipment's frequencies, leading them through gaps in the coverage. More importantly, she understood the team's standard operating procedures, anticipating their movements with an intelligence that still amazed Ethan. As the teams began their final preparations, Ethan initiated their countermove. He activated several remote weather stations on his property, legitimate equipment he'd used for years, but had reprogrammed them to emit signals that would interfere with the team's detection gear. The resulting electronic noise would create a brief window of opportunity. The moment arrived with the first light of dawn. While the teams were distracted by the signal interference, Ethan, Dakota, and Baxter moved silently through the woods behind the cabin. Dakota led the way, her acute senses guiding them through blind spots in the surveillance network. Baxter, now strong enough to keep up, followed closely, seeming to understand the need for absolute quiet. They reached the hidden truck without detection. As Ethan carefully removed the camouflage, he noticed Dakota's attention fix on something in the distance. Following her gaze, he spotted movement near the old barn. Someone was checking the structure where they'd found the backpack. Their window of opportunity was closing. The truck started smoothly, its modified engine barely a whisper in the morning air. Dakota positioned herself in the back seat, Baxter secure beside her, as Ethan guided the vehicle along a little-known trail that led away from the main road. His knowledge of the terrain would be their saving grace. There were paths through these woods that didn't appear on any official maps. Behind them, the first signs of alarm began to spread through the teams as they discovered the cabin empty. But by then, Ethan's truck was already deep in the wilderness, following a route that would take them to the abandoned research station near the Canadian border. The coordinates from Dakota's collar had revealed more than just a location. They pointed to a facility that had been part of an early environmental monitoring network, one that predated Project Aurora. As they traveled, Dakota's behavior began to change. The tension she'd carried since arriving at Ethan's cabin gradually eased. She seemed to recognize landmarks, suggesting she'd been to their destination before. Baxter, feeding off his mother's calmer energy, settled into a peaceful sleep. Hours later, they arrived at the old research station. The facility was well hidden, its existence obscured by years of strategic neglect. But inside, Ethan found exactly what the decoded notes had promised: a fully equipped sanctuary, maintained in secret by a network of environmental scientists who had opposed Project Aurora's military direction. The station's communication equipment, though dated, was still functional. Ethan made contact with Sarah, who revealed herself as part of this hidden network. She had been working for years to protect animals like Dakota from exploitation. The station, she explained, was one of several safe houses established for precisely this purpose. As Ethan watched Dakota and Baxter explore their new sanctuary, he understood that his life had changed irrevocably. His quiet existence had been transformed into something more meaningful. He had become part of a mission to protect extraordinary beings like Dakota from those who would exploit their gifts. Dakota approached him, pressing her head against his hand in a gesture of trust and gratitude. Baxter playfully circled them both, his joyful energy a reminder of why their journey had been necessary. In this remote haven, surrounded by the pristine Alaskan wilderness, they had found not just safety, but a new purpose. The end. Dear viewers, we hope the story of Ethan, Dakota, and Baxter has touched your hearts. Their journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come from protecting those we love. We've prepared a special playlist featuring equally captivating stories about extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. Find it by clicking the link on your left. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the incredible connections we share with our four-legged friends. Don't miss our upcoming content. We can't wait to read your thoughts in the comments section.